All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we are diving into the tragically short life and career of Kieth Whitley, so stick around. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot tell you how excited I am for the Kennedy Meadows Music Festival, which is coming up August 22nd to 24th. So I'll be the MC this year, so I'll be there all weekend long, and I'm playing, it sounds like on Saturday. And last year was the first Kennedy Meadows Music Festival, and it was an absolute blast. We had Dave Stamey is going to be there again this year. We had Dallas Burrows last year. Dallas Burrows, that show was amazing last year, and he's coming again this year. Ben Haggard is headlining. Chad Bushnell is going to be there. It's going to be an absolute party, and I can't tell you how stoked I am. And now is the time to get your tickets. So if you've been thinking about doing it, now is the time. And I've got a promo code for you guys. The promo code is GeorgeCroftKM at checkout here to get your tickets for the Kennedy Meadows Music Festival. So come on out. They've got there's campsites available. There's RV campsites. There's tent campsites. I think the cabins are sold out right this second, but there's first come first serve camping in the campgrounds below in the Forest Service campgrounds. It's going to be an awesome weekend full of fun and just fantastic performances. So come on out, get your tickets while you can. I've also got some dates coming up, so come out and see me. I'll be June 19th. I'll be at Tano's in Orangevale. And the next day, June 20th, I'll be at Red Bus Brewing in Folsom. And then, obviously, the big news is the Kennedy Meadows Music Festival, August 22nd to 24th. So come on out and see me. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler&Co_marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything, when he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some big news coming up here. So I have started an Indiegogo campaign to produce and launch my next single called To Be Enough. And I'm very passionate about this project. It's one of my favorite songs I've ever written. And I'm going to give it 100% effort here to get this thing professionally done, released, and promoted across all the different social media platforms and everything else. Kind of put all my eggs in this basket for now and see how far I can take it. But for that to work, I need public support, and that can be found on my Indiegogo page, which can be found on my link tree, which is through either my TikTok or Instagram account. If you go to my links, my Indiegogo campaign is the top one. And I would love and appreciate any support that you guys feel like giving. And we're going to try to make a real go of this thing. So please, if you don't mind, check that out. And hopefully I'll see you soon. All right, so Kieth Whitley is one of my favorite artists of the 80s and 90s. Well, 80s. And the story really, the more I dug into it, the more you realize it's such a tragedy because his life is so underpinned by his struggles with addiction and kind of just unnecessary self-destruct phases. Juxtaposed by just a wildly talented guy, and his vocal quality and his ear for picking good songs. He just seemed like such a cool dude and just such a powerhouse musically. and it, and he cuts it short for really no good reason. But anyway, so he's born in 1954 in Kentucky, and he grows up in Sandy Hook. So I think he's born in Ashland, but then he quickly ends up in Sandy Hook, where he spends his childhood. And growing up in Kentucky during that time, so first of all, it's immediately apparent to his mom and dad that he is a musically, like he's just a musical dude from the time he's like 3 or 4. So he grows up, singing with his parents and, stuff. So, but his mom talks about when he's a baby, like 3 and 4 years old, she's like rocking him to sleep, singing him lullabies, and he's harmonizing with her, which is unreal. I mean, you pick that up in church, I guess. But so this little, toddler is singing a harmony with his mom as she's trying to, rock him to sleep. And he doesn't ever seem to have had any intention to do anything but music from the time he's just a little tyke here. To the point where at 8 years old, he's performing on the radio. And in Kentucky at this time, you're in the heart of bluegrass territory. And he's a wildly talented bluegrass artist immediately. And like I said, so he's learned to play guitar playing guitar well enough to be on the radio at 8 years old that's insane. And but that's the kind of guy he starts out to be. And he's immediately he's starting little bands, he's performing wherever he can, he's getting, brought up on stage with other artists and stuff. And he actually, let's see here, I think they meet when they're little, like before high school, I think. He meets Ricky Skaggs, who is another artist that we might do an episode on later. Ricky Skaggs kind of stays more in the bluegrass territory for most of his career. But anyway, so him and Ricky Skaggs end up, super tight friends, palling around, doing bands together, performing together. And Whitley's dad and both of his parents were totally supportive of his, musical ambitions. And his dad kind of had a rule where it was like, if we go anywhere, you're bringing your instruments just in case there's a chance for you to play somewhere. And that really pays off quickly, because I think when he's 13, I found there's a little bit of discrepancies in the timeline here. Some place it when he's 13, some place it when he's closer to 15. I think it's closer to 15 is the correct one, just based on the timeline here. But so him and Ricky Skaggs are, like I said, they're bluegrass kids, and they idolized Ralph Stanley, who was a huge bluegrass artist at the time. And Ralph Stanley and his band, I think what's the name of their? I have it here. Let's see here. The Clinch Mountain Boys was Ricky Skaggs' band, and the bluegrass bands at the time seemed to be like the Something Mountain Boys is like. They just changed what the something is. So Ricky Skaggs and Kieth Whitley, their little band was the Lonesome Mountain Boys. And then the Clinch Mountain Boys is Ralph Stanley. So Kieth and Ricky Skaggs and they're kind of known around their little communities already, but they hear that Ralph Stanley's coming to town and they want to go to the show. So, they load up in the car. Keith's dad takes him to the show, and he did his classic, hey, bring your instruments just in case something wild happens. And that paid off so hard for the boys in this moment, because on the way to that show, Ralph Stanley's car breaks down. He blows a tire somewhere on the highway, and he ends up being like an hour late to this gig that he's supposed to play. And Kieth and Ricky Skaggs are at this venue, and the guy running the show knows the boys, and he says, hey, why don't you get up there and fill time until Ralph Stanley gets here? So the boys just grab their stuff, get on stage, and start playing, and they're knocking it out of the park, and they're playing Ralph Stanley's stuff. And the thing about bluegrass music, especially back then, vocally, they're all pretty similar. Like, they've got that deep, Kentucky accent, and they sing in a pretty high register, and it's super upbeat. So they sound a lot like each other. Most of these bands sound a lot like each other, to the point where Ralph Stanley walks into the building and he hears what he thinks is the venue just playing his records to fill time. And as soon as he realizes that this is live music coming from these two teenage boys on stage, he's immediately impressed and proceeds to like pal up with the boys and take them on the road. So for Kieth and Ricky Skaggs, it's this moment of like just a like opportunity met preparedness in this beautiful moment where they jump up on stage and nail these songs so hard. And then their musical hero walks in, hears them doing it, and is like, you guys are awesome, come with me. And just proceeds to like take them on the road. And Kieth Whitley, so Ricky Skaggs, I think, I saw an interview where Ralph Stanley said that Ricky stayed with him for, I think, 3 or 4 years. But Kieth Whitley stayed with him for like 7 or 8. So, and they're touring all over the place. They're going to Japan. They're going all over the country. Like Kieth Whitley just becomes kind of an integral member of Ralph Stanley's band. And now this is where two things, like the old, same demons that have haunted everybody else we've talked about, show up at the same time as success here. Because in Kentucky at the time, I mean, this is like bootleg alcohol territory all day long. Like, this is moonshine and Kentucky are like synonymous. And so Kieth Whitley discovers alcohol pretty early on, by the time he's 15. And for whatever reason, there's this little, Ralph Stanley had kind of a policy of not drinking with his bandmates, except when it came to Kieth Whitley. And they have a weird interaction, I think when they were in Japan, and they're like close friends at this point, Ralph Stanley and Kieth Whitley. They're close enough friends that he shares a drink with 15-year-old Kieth Whitley, or he might have been 16 at the time. And he said something to him to the effect of like, I don't drink with these other guys, but you seem like you can handle it. And that was a mistake, because, initially it didn't cause too many issues, but that's the start of Kieth Whitley's problem that would eventually kill him. Because, he starts, having experiences where he's going on these nasty benders and stuff. And it doesn't seem to have really affected his ability to perform early on. But it's just that problem starts. Like, it's a little spark that would grow into this fire of a problem. But during this time, his mom talks about like these kind of sweet stories where like, he's still a kid. He's still, living at home when he's not on the road. And and his mom and him were very close. So he'd come home, and she talks about how like if she was awake, he'd come home just worn out. She'd just like rub his shoulders till he fell asleep, and then he'd wake up the next day and go do it again. And if he came home and she was asleep, he would just like kind of grab her foot, and he'd be like, "Hey, I'm home, Mom," and she'd, "Okay," and then he'd go to bed and wake up, do it again the next day. And so that's his life for his his later teenage years. And so now, of course, he gets married here somewhere. I think when he's 20. Let's see. Oh, okay. So he gets married when he's 23. So he moves to Nashville when he's 21. So this is, that 6 or 7 year period where he's on the road with Ralph Stanley. Eventually he leaves the band to go pursue his own musical career, and he moves to Nashville. Now, that's in 1975 when he's 21 years old. And it's not like he just moves there and is immediately successful. I mean, you're not supposed to, he's 21. So like he's the new kid in town, and he's doing everything he can, working side jobs, playing for whoever will let him. And, but he really, he kind of shows up in Nashville in this period in the late 70s to early 80s, where Nashville is kind of in a transitional period where it's trying to modernize, but like it's struggling generally. The industry is struggling with modernizing, but not abandoning its country roots. And bluegrass was, on the traditional end of the spectrum. And so he wants to start, stretching his legs out into the kind of contemporary country music end of things. And let's see here. So he moves to Nashville when he's 21, and he gets married when he's 23 to a lady named Kathleen, but they call her Luann Wheeler. And she's also from Kentucky, but she's in Nashville. Somehow they meet and they get married. And almost immediately, that marriage is on the rocks because of his drinking. Like, at that point, his drinking was enough of a problem. And so that marriage is tense almost immediately. And so, let's see here. So, 1983. So, there's a few years in there. So, he moves to Nashville in 1975 when he's 21. And then in 1983, so what is that, 7 or 8 years later, he finally gets signed with RCA Records. So it wasn't like he just moved there and then took off. It's like even like the Willie Nelson story, he moves there and grinds writing songs for people, but he's achieving success within like a year. That's Willie Nelson, not Kieth Whitley. He's in the grind for 7 or 8 years here. And so he signs with RCA, and but this is, again, man, the demons just following along Kieth Whitley here, and just tragedy, because right when he signs with RCA, his older brother dies in a motorcycle accident, and that just cuts Kieth Whitley in half. That whole family was really tight, and he, and him and his brother were obviously really close. So almost simultaneously, he gets signed at RCA, and his brother dies, which has a exacerbating effect on Keith's alcoholism, which is, at this point, he's an alcoholic. He's not just a dude that likes to party. He's an alcoholic at this point. And there are later stories where you see him talking about stuff where this is where you start to see the split happening in Keith's mind, where he sees alcohol as a problem. He knows he has an issue, and he's also in denial about it. So, like, that manifests itself as most people around him would describe him as, oh no, Kieth doesn't drink. I've never seen him drink around me. Like, he would turn down beers from, like, people, hey, you want a beer? And he'd be like, no, I don't drink. And then 20 minutes later, he would be just hammered because he'd go find whiskey or whatever and just drink to the point of being useless. But that develops kind of over time. But we're already in here where he feels the need to outwardly portray, oh no, I don't drink, while he's in the closeted severe alcoholism. And anyway, so that's like I said, that's tearing at his first marriage as this is going along, and that, like, so his alcoholism is ramping up. He gets signed with RCA, and his brother dies in 1984. Then in 1985, he gets divorced from his first wife, and that was clearly all connected. Like, that's all part of his trajectory here. But then quickly thereafter, into Keith's life walks Lori Morgan. Now, Lori Morgan is somebody who I had no idea the pivotal role she would play across country music. I wasn't super schooled on the Lori Morgan history, but she's a person. I mean, she's still alive and doing well. I would kill to talk to Lori Morgan. But so because Lori Morgan started out, she was married to George Jones's bass player. And during the time, like in our George Jones episode where we're talking about, he's had this psychotic split after his divorce from Tammy Wynette, and he's doing the whole Donald Duck and the old man thing. Like, Lori Morgan is a young, singer married to one of his band members, and she's just knee deep in that whole process. Like, so she's on the road with George Jones as this is happening. And she has a podcast of her own that I suggest, if you like this show, go check out Lori Morgan's show. I think it's called War Paint. And because she's talking, as of a year or a couple of years ago, she's talking to all these peripheral people. So like she interviews George Jones's last wife, Nancy, and they're talking about all this stuff about what used to happen on the road and kind of where people were at the time and kind of how this, plays out. So, so she's married to George Jones's bass player. They have a kid together named Morgan. And then, but that bass player and George Jones have their own sort of tragic relationship because George Jones, famous, I mean, we talked about it, like George Jones's alcoholism and cocaine use was just a disaster area. And, to the point where George Jones fires that bass player. And because George Jones kind of got his act together and had to do something to kind of and it kind of went to that bass player and was like, hey man, if I cleaned up, you got to clean up because this is just not working. And the guy couldn't do it. So he, his addiction and alcoholism is bad enough that he gets fired from George Jones's band and his marriage to Lori Morgan falls apart. But she's around the whole time. Like she tells a story about like there was a time where like she was enough of like one of the guys that there's a Christmas somewhere in here where George Jones's gift to the band was a big block of cocaine. And it was like, here boys, this is your, Christmas present. And they're like passing this thing around and it gets to Lori Morgan and she's like, I don't want that. I want an actual gift because I'm not touching this stuff. And she says she never did. Like Lori Morgan never touched cocaine during this whole time. And she was the only band member at the time to be like, no, like you're going to give me something for Christmas, make it something good. And George Jones ends up buying her, I think, 2 pairs of boots as her Christmas gift. And then that caused like a bunch of tension where like all the rest of the band members, got like jealous or whatever because they, snorted their Christmas gift. But Lori Morgan gets these 2 pairs of boots from George Jones. And she stays, and she was also good friends with Tammy Wynette. So like she talks about, later they were close because they both had similar interests and similar, life stories, and they both like to cook. So she talks about like going to Tammy's house and making dumplings or something, So Lori Morgan, and she's pretty young at this time too. So anyway, so by the time Kieth Whitley is around, she's already been through 1 marriage and she has a kid. And, but because her father was, a big guy in country music, so she's around the Grand Ole Opry and she meets Kieth Whitley at the Opry. And they quickly, and by the way, like she was, you can imagine Kieth Whitley out of his first marriage and things are kind of going kind of sideways for him. But he shows up at the Opry and here is drop dead gorgeous Lori Morgan, who had already been a fan of his. Like she already had found some of his bluegrass work and she was aware of him through the country music circles. And so when they meet, they're in love immediately. And they proceed to kind of, it's so funny to me. Like, so George Jones and Tammy Wynette get crowned the king and queen of country music. Somehow Lori Morgan gets dubbed the Duchess of country music. Like, I don't know what our obsession is with like royal terms or whatever, but like king and queen was already taken. So Lori and Kieth were like the Duke and Duchess. I don't know. But as a nod to their, who they were at the time, like they were enough of a power couple at the time that people were also, they were country music royalty. And they end up doing a lot of duets together. Like they worked together a lot. And by all accounts, Kieth Whitley, when he's not drinking, and she maintains to this day, when Kieth was not drinking, he was the perfect husband and partner. He was super supportive. He was never like jealous about, her, successes or any of that. It made him nervous, but it wasn't, he never said a cross word to her when he was sober. And she maintains that he was never, even when he was drinking, Kieth Whitley was never abusive to her. And he had severe issues, but she stuck with him because he was so good to her when he was sober. And this is where like I said, just, you start to see just a brutal tragedy of it all here, because those two are clearly in love and it's clearly going fine. And they get married, they have a kid together. And there's all these, sweet pictures of Kieth Whitley and his. So Kieth Whitley, not only do they have a kid together, but Kieth Whitley adopts Lori Morgan's daughter Morgan from her previous marriage. Kieth Whitley adopts her and like seems to have leaned into that with his whole heart. Like that little girl refers to Kieth Whitley as that's her dad. Like that's daddy to this, girl who was, I think she was like 3 at the time or something. And he really like on the family front here, it seems like everything's going great. He's got his beautiful and successful wife. He's got these 2 kids. His music career is starting to take off here. But at the same time, he's completely falling to his alcohol problem while he's hiding it. So like I said, like at the time, people see them as this like, oh, how does it get better than this? And people that are around him are like offering him drinks and he's turning them down. He's like, oh no, I don't drink. But then Lori would, find him passed out on the bed and he's, so he's clearly still in the throes of alcoholism. But so his career, like I said, this is where we're starting to get some real hits here. So let's see here. I think it was in 1985. He finally breaks the top 20 with Miami, Miami. And that song really does. That's the gear shift in his career that really kind of shoots him off into the spotlight. And it's the first of many. But let's see here. So, and I think that actually might have happened right before him and Lori got together. He actually, and this is where we start like simultaneously the country music scene is kind of going through these changes and stuff. And Kieth Whitley at one point is told that this one album that he makes is too country, which kind of threw him for a loop because he was like, what industry am I in? Like, I thought this was country music. But they actually like his album doesn't do well and they tell him it's because it's too country. So he releases, Miami, Miami in 1985 and it's a way more polished record, which apparently was what the industry was looking for. And it is a success. So, talk all the smack you want about it. It was received well by the market. So I don't know what being too country means, but apparently they fixed the issue. And also, so Kieth Whitley was a prolific art. So he's not writing a lot of songs. Like he writes a few and he co-writes a few, but he's kind of another one of these guys similar to Kenny Rogers and George Jones, just kind of knows how to pick a good song. When he hears a good demo tape, if it clicks in his head, he can take it and make it his own. He was sort of known for being able to do that, where like once Kieth Whitley got his hands on a song, he made it his own. And it was always like better than the demo tapes, which apparently is not always the case in Nashville. But that was for Kieth Whitley. And he recorded stuff constantly because later his decisions on what songs to release becomes a decision-making process of elimination, like what songs not to release. And so he's got this whole vault full of unreleased songs. But anyway, but he seems to be making good decisions here, and his career is doing, really well. So let's see here. And then, so this is, let's see here. So I think his son is born in 1987 when Keith's 33. And, this is where you get all these sweet pictures of Kieth just in full dad mode, changing diapers and doing, like mixing formula for kids. Like he really seems to have been at his best, a great dad and partner and just super positive things happening on the home front here. But like I said, simultaneously, he is unable to kick that alcohol problem. And it starts to become an issue enough to where he kind of quietly ends up going to rehab a couple of times. One of the more notable ones, and by the way, Lori Morgan's career at the same time is also doing well. So like Keith's getting all these hits, Lori Morgan is also getting hits, and their careers kind of have them in different places sometimes. And so, it gets down to, I think 1980, this is probably late 87, 88, somewhere in there. The RCA, with the producer's name, who I wrote down but is going to escape me here, basically tells Kieth Whitley, hey man, go to rehab or we're dropping you from the label. And that was enough to like, it got under Keith's skin enough to where he agrees to go, and he's like begging him to like, to please don't drop me. Like, I'll do anything, I'll go to rehab, blah, blah, blah. And so I think right before he leaves for rehab, he writes a song called Tell Lori I Love Her, which is this very sweet, song. And it's about Lori Morgan. It's named for her, which, by the way, Lori Morgan is named after Loretta Lynn, which I thought was a cool little tie-in, because we're going to do a Loretta Lynn episode later, but because Loretta Lynn and Tammy Wynette were kind of running side by side, and then Lori Morgan is young enough to be named after Loretta Lynn while she's in the same orbit while George Jones is going through his like post, Tammy Wynette debacle and all that stuff. So like Lori is enough of that system that she's doing all this while she's named after one of the, top singers of her time. And, but anyway, so Kieth Whitley writes, Tell Lori I Love Her, which in hindsight, when you listen to that song now, it's so sad because because he ends up dying, and that's, it's like his last love letter to Lori Morgan. But so at the time though, he writes this song, he goes to rehab, and Lori tells a story about when they go to pick him up from the airport, and they had tried. So I wish I had, if my eyes find this guy's name. Anyway, the guy that told him that he was going to drop him from the label, Lori had initially invited him to come to the airport and pick Keith up from rehab and kind of have this kind of nice, new beginnings moment. Well, something happened and that guy just couldn't make it. Well, Lori gets to the airport to pick Keith up. He gets off the plane drunk, like hammered. Like he walked out of rehab onto a plane and proceeds to just get housed immediately. So that rehab stint did not stick. And he's on all these different, medications and stuff to try to help with this problem. This is the phase where you get Lori Morgan. She snaps into full trying to save Keith mode. And, it's just a tragedy to watch in hindsight, because she's doing everything she possibly can to help this guy, to the point where she's telling stories about there was right after that rehab stint, there was something about some medication that he was on that if he drank too much, it would kill him. It was just she needed that medication to get out of his system over at least for a couple of days or something. So she's doing things like she'll lay down next to him. She takes the belt off of her bathrobe and ties her leg to his leg so that he can't get away from her in the middle of the night and go, find something to drink. And he's doing stuff that is he's drinking anything he can find with alcohol in it. So we're talking cologne, we're talking like mouthwash, like whatever, anything and some stuff that doesn't have alcohol in it. Like one of his band members said that he would drink like shampoo bottles, which I've never heard of that before. But I mean, if that would just go to illustrate the desperation with which this dude is trying to find a drink when he gets the chance. And but she seems to kind of get it. He survives that initial phase, and Lori is on top of him 24 hours a day, trying to make sure he doesn't get access to booze. And she said, even at that time, he would complain like, oh my God, you're going to go to the bathroom with me? Like, come on, I'm not going to do anything. And she's like, nope, I'm going to be right next to you the whole time. Do what you got to do. We're getting back in bed. Like there are no unobserved moments for some of these, spans of time. And he kind of starts to seem like he's doing okay. But then, again, like right in the crux of this phase where Lori's like tying herself to him and like doing everything she can, his dad dies, which his dad had been this supportive guy in his life the entire time. So you can imagine that, if you're on the edge of something and then your dad dies, it's enough to push you over. And anyway, so that continues to be this, it just adds to the problem. And so quickly thereafter, I think in 1988. So he's 34 years old. This is where he releases. So he releases "Don't Close Your Eyes," which is another gigantic. He goes on a string where he gets like 5 number ones in a row, and so this is like peak Kieth Whitley, public facing. Like he's very similar to George Jones, where like George Jones is absolutely falling apart, but his career is taken off. That's the phase that we're in for Kieth Whitley here, where if you ask anybody else, he's doing great. What could possibly go wrong? He's married to Lori Morgan. He's got this beautiful family. He's a great family guy. He's turning down drinks when people offer them to him. Like what? And he's got all these number ones coming out. So like, what could be going wrong here? And so anyway, so he does "When You Say Nothing at All," and later in 1989. So he's still 34 years old. He's blacking out again. Like we're very clearly, Lori knows she's knee deep in this problem. Like we're kind of in the fight here. But there comes a time when her career has taken off to the point where she has to go on this album press tour. And she knows something's up, and she just gets like a bad feeling about leaving. But the label is like, "Hey, you got to go." And she actually begs the label to not make her go. She says, I got a bad feeling about Kieth. I need to be home for this. And the label kind of was like, "Hey, he's either going to get it fixed or he's not. You need to be on the road," which I don't know how I feel about that. Like you could lay a lot of blame on the record label in that moment, but also you never know what's going to happen. You never know what people's lives are like, so I don't exactly know how to feel about that decision. So Lori gets pressured into going, and Kieth writes her a letter. And it was kind of common, like whenever they would, get on planes and separate, he would write her these nice little love notes and things. And so he writes her a note, puts her on the plane. She doesn't read it for like a week or something, but he goes home, and let's see here. There's a date on here, May 9th, I think. So the morning of May 9th, 1989, Kieth wakes up, and his mom, who was still alive at the time, also had a bad feeling, enough that she calls him in the morning, and she just wanted to like hear his voice and make sure he's okay. And he sounded fine, and he was sober, and he talks to his mom for like 30 minutes or something. Then his brother-in-law comes over, and him and his brother-in-law just have coffee and talk about songs he's got coming up and have this totally normal conversation. And they make plans to go golfing later in the day. So his brother-in-law is basically like, "Okay, like I'm going to go." He had something else to do, but he was going to be back in a couple hours. So he's like, "I'm going to go to handle my stuff. I'll come pick you up and we'll go golf." That was the plan. So his mom had talked to him in the morning. His brother-in-law goes and has coffee with him in the morning. Nothing's wrong. His brother-in-law leaves. His brother-in-law returns an hour later, and Kieth is unresponsive on the bed in his room with like the equivalent of 21 shots of alcohol in his system. And he never wakes up from that. And it caught everybody off guard because he, like I said, he seemed so fine that morning. Nobody thought this was an issue. He was totally sober and operational. And then as soon as he got a minute to himself, he went in there and just, drank himself to death in one fell swoop. And that proceeds to, all the blame games started. There were some crazy conspiracy theories about how like Lori Morgan, basically assassinated him or had him killed on purpose kind of thing, which is just ridiculous. But because she immediately, obviously, feels terrible. She immediately blames herself for going on this tour when she knew there was something off. And for several years, she's, struggling with what every surviving family member of this kind of thing struggles with, of like, she's blaming herself and trying to, wondering what she could have done different. But so are the rest of his friends and family. I mean, everybody's going through this, but it sounds like the fans in general were not super great to Lori Morgan initially during this time. And she says she wrote a book later, which is worth reading. where she really digs into the specifics of things that happened and things that went wrong. And she later comes to, she comes to forgive herself later, and she, understands that it's like, it's not her fault that this is a disease that Kieth had, and Kieth did this to himself. But right when this is happening, so him and Lori had recorded a duet together, and, but it hadn't been released yet. And so that's, let's see here, Till a Tear Becomes a Rose is a song that he does with Lori Morgan. And that song, obviously, I mean, it's kind of similar to when Hank Williams died, when, like, he had music that was in production when he died, so it's released after his death. And then because he had just died and everybody's talking about it, that song is a giant success because that's all anybody's talking about. And so that, that happens here also. And, but just an unmitigated tragedy, because this dude was at the top of his career with so much positive stuff going on in his life, but whatever demon he had was just working overtime and wins eventually. And, but he just leaves this giant mark across country music to where, Vince Gill actually, so him and Vince Gill were friends. They were kind of just in similar orbits. They hadn't worked together a lot, but they were around each other enough. And in Vince Gill's story, which I hope to do someday, Vince Gill writes a song called Go Rest High on the Mountain. And so Vince Gill is going through some tragedy of his own at the time, and he says that he started writing that song when Kieth Whitley died. So there's a line in the song that kind of, makes that obvious, where it says, you were no stranger to the rain, which was a callback to one of Kieth Whitley's songs, I'm No Stranger to the Rain. And, but it's this, I mean, if you go back and listen to Vince Gill sing that song, it's a tearjerker of a song, especially when you see him singing it on stage with Alison Krauss, who would go on to covered When You Say Nothing at All, and it was one of the biggest songs of her career, which was Kieth Whitley's song. So Alison Krauss, who had a deep career tie to Kieth Whitley, and Ricky Skaggs, who was Kieth Whitley's boyhood friend and sort of came up in the country music scene alongside him. Those two people are singing 3-part harmony with Vince Gill to a song that he initially started writing about Kieth Whitley's death. He started writing it about Kieth Whitley, and then he the song didn't get finished, but then Vince Gill's brother dies, and that's sort of that tragedy. He finishes the song, and I'm not exactly clear on how much of the song was done, because like I said, there's that line about not being a stranger to the rain, but in later interviews, Vince Gill just says, oh yeah, I wrote that song when my brother died. He doesn't, there are a bunch of interviews in which he doesn't mention Kieth Whitley at all in relationship to that song, but it's obviously very clear that it's part of it. And, but anyway, so when you see some of these, performances and interviews, it's just, I mean, good luck not crying when you watch that deal, when all three of them are barely holding it together, cranking out this just beautiful, broken-hearted 3-part harmony, singing about, one of country music's legends. That song kind of gets repurposed a lot. They sing it at a couple of different funerals. Like, they sing it at George Jones' funeral, and that's another tearjerker of a performance to watch, because George Jones had just died, and if you know that whole story, George Jones and Vince Gill had become friends. And I think George Jones used to call Vince Gill Sweet Pea. Like, that was his nickname for him. And there's a bunch of funny interviews you can see where, like, them together on the George Jones show, and kind of they perform together, and they're clearly friends. But so Vince Gill is just watching these people, pass away in front of him, and he's written this just, like I said, just a tearjerker of a song. And it's worth crying about. It's such just a beautiful performance and delivery. And Kieth Whitley's influence, I mean, it's still around today. I think Morgan Wallen just kind of rewrote Miami, and kind of added his own stuff to it. Now, people feel about that how you will. It's a nod to Kieth Whitley. But yeah, that was just, I think, last year or the year before that Morgan Wallen did that. And so, you obviously, even till today, you can see Kieth Whitley's influence in country music, because his voice was just so top notch. I mean, him and George Jones, similarly, people talk about like, hey, if we could all sound the way we wanted to sound, we'd sound like that guy. And you hear people say that about George Jones and Kieth Whitley, because his range was incredible. His, the depth to his voice was just endless. And he picked these really good songs to do, and he put his own mark on them in a way that, you just can't imagine anybody else doing some of these. And, the Tell Lori I Love Her thing, so he writes that song. He just does it as a demo tape. He doesn't mean to release that song. He just, it's released. I think that gets released after his death, because even now when you go back and listen to it, you hear the vocal or the sound production quality difference, where that's clearly just Kieth in a room playing guitar. He didn't do a bunch of, there's not separate tracks and things. This is just Kieth playing a demo, but it's the song Tell Lori I Love Her. And then just a little added heartbreaking note is, so I'm listening to Lori Morgan's podcast, and in the beginning of the first episode, her son, Jesse, who's Kieth and her's son, calls her in the middle of this podcast, and her phone rings, and her ringtone is Tell Lori I Love Her. So she's getting a call from Kieth Whitley's son a couple of years ago, and that's still her ringtone on her phone. Which, like I said, just goes to show you the impact this dude had, and the just bottomless darkness of the tragedy of his short life and career, but had such a positive impact, on country music and music in general throughout, the 80s and 90s, and like I said, even to today. And I can listen to Kieth Whitley songs all day long. I mean, that his body of work, he just doesn't miss, man. They're so good and so iconic, but like I said, tragically cut short. He did talk a little bit about in his moments where he's being asked about this kind of thing, because there's interviews where Kieth is explaining that he had an alcohol problem and he had to stop. Well, he's still drinking at the time, so he's in clear denial while he's telling these stories. But he talks about I felt like that's what I had to do, because that's how Hank did it, that's how George Jones did it. And you don't know if that's at that late stage of the game. You could say, oh yeah, that's why he was drinking. He was an alcoholic at the time when he said that. And I think he was saying that as a way to explain it to himself, because good luck explaining that to yourself while you're self-destructing this otherwise beautiful family and career. So I think when he does talk about, kind of laying it at the feet of the country music industry and his heroes, I think the damage is already done there. I think he would have been that guy without Hank Williams and George Jones. Like you said, he started drinking when he was 15 in Kentucky, so the damage was there. And but anyway, so it's the juxtaposition of just endless tragedy and endless talent and quality. Like I said, his body of work is one of the best on the planet. But anyway, so that is the story of Kieth Whitley. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.